The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each micro-adjustment calculated and deliberate. Around her, the rest of SEAL Team 7 prepared for what their intelligence reports promised would be a routine extraction mission. Routine had become a dirty word in Maria's vocabulary over her 8 years of service. Nothing was ever routine in these mountains, where every ridge could hide an ambush and every village might shelter enemies or allies, depending on which way the political winds were blowing that particular week. Santos, you getting a good read on those coordinates? Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison's voice crackled through her earpiece. Morrison was a good officer, Maria knew. He listened to his team, trusted their expertise, and didn't let his ego override tactical sense. Those qualities had kept Team 7 alive through 17 missions together. "Crystal clear, sir," Maria replied, scanning the valley below through her scope. "I've got eyes on the compound. 2 guards visible on the north wall, one making rounds every 4 minutes. The pattern's been consistent for the past hour." The compound sat like a concrete scar against the mountainside, its high walls and guard towers speaking to the paranoia of whoever had built it. Intelligence suggested it housed a high-value target, a Taliban commander who'd been coordinating attacks against coalition forces across 3 provinces. The plan was simple: get in, extract the target, and any useful intelligence, get out before anyone knew they'd been there. Maria had heard that song before. Simple plans had a way of becoming complicated very quickly. "Rodriguez, what's the status on our approach route?" Morrison's voice cut through the pre-mission tension that always settled over the team like morning fog. Petty Officer First Class Diego Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and keyed his radio. "Path looks clear, sir. No movement detected along the eastern approach. The dry creek bed will give us good concealment until we're within 50 meters of the outer wall." Rodriguez was Team 7's point man, a role that required equal parts courage and caution. Maria had watched him thread the needle between enemy positions more times than she could count, always finding the path that kept them invisible until the moment they needed to be seen. "Thompson, Garcia, you 2 ready to party?" Morrison's question carried the casual tone of a man asking about weekend plans rather than a combat operation that could go sideways in a heartbeat. Chief Petty Officer Mike Thompson checked his explosives kit one final time. "Charges are prepped and ready, sir. I can put a door-sized hole in that wall in about 3 seconds, or I can open it quiet-like if stealth's still on the menu." Thompson was an artist with explosives. Maria had seen him blow a lock off a door without scratching the paint on either side of it, and she'd also watched him bring down a 3-story building with charges placed so precisely that the structure collapsed inward without damaging the buildings on either side. Petty Officer Second Class Luis Garcia patted the medical kit strapped to his vest. "Ready to patch up whoever needs patching, sir. Let's just try to keep the blood loss to a minimum this time." Garcia's dry humor masked his genuine concern for every member of the team. He'd pulled more than one SEAL back from the edge when bullets started flying, and his quick thinking with battlefield medicine had saved lives that the manual said couldn't be saved. "All right, people," Morrison said, settling into the command voice that Maria had learned to trust implicitly. "We move in 20 minutes. Santos, you'll provide overwatch from this position. The rest of us go in quiet, grab our package, and extract through the western route. If this goes loud, I want precise fire only. We don't know who else might be in that compound." Maria nodded, though Morrison couldn't see her from his position 30 meters to her left. Overwatch was both the most important and most frustrating job in any operation. She'd be the team's eyes and ears, their guardian angel with a rifle, but she'd also be largely powerless to help if things went wrong up close. The waiting was always the hardest part. Maria settled into her shooting position, a small depression in the rocks that gave her perfect sight lines to the compound, while keeping her concealed from any observers below. Her rifle, a modified M110 that she'd personally fine-tuned over hundreds of hours at the range, felt like an extension of her own body. She'd started shooting as a child in rural Texas, where her grandfather had taught her to hunt deer in the hill country outside San Antonio. Patience and precision, he'd always said. Those two things will take you farther than raw talent ever will. The old man had been right about more than hunting, it turned out. Maria's path to the SEALs hadn't been conventional. Women weren't officially allowed in combat roles when she'd first enlisted, but bureaucratic barriers had a way of crumbling when you could consistently put rounds on target at ranges that made other shooters shake their heads in disbelief. She'd started as a Navy intelligence specialist, but her shooting scores had caught attention at higher levels. When the rules changed and combat positions opened to women, Maria was among the first to volunteer for SEAL training. Bud/S had been 6 months of carefully controlled hell, designed to break anyone who wasn't absolutely committed to the mission. Out of her class of 147 candidates, only 18 had completed the program. Maria had been the only woman. The graduation ceremony had been surreal. Admirals and generals had lined up to shake her hand and pose for photos that would grace recruiting posters for years to come. But what had mattered to Maria was the simple nod of respect from her instructors and the knowledge that she'd earned her place through the same standards that every other SEAL had met. That had been 3 years ago. Since then, she'd deployed twice to Iraq and 3 times to Afghanistan, building a reputation for precision shooting that had earned her a spot on one of the Navy's most elite teams. Team 7 handled the missions that other SEAL teams couldn't or wouldn't take, the operations where failure meant more than just mission failure. Movement in the compound, Maria reported, watching through her scope as a figure emerged from the main building. Single individual, appears to be checking the perimeter. He's armed but doesn't seem alert. Copy that, Morrison responded. 15 minutes to entry. Keep us posted on any changes. The figure in the compound moved with the casual confidence of someone who felt secure in his environment. Maria tracked him through her scope, noting his route and timing. Information was ammunition in operations like this, and every detail might prove crucial if the mission went sideways. A slight breeze picked up from the valley floor, carrying the scent of cooking fires and dust. Maria automatically compensated for the wind, adjusting her scope's windage settings with the unconscious precision of long practice. At the ranges she typically engaged targets, wind could mean the difference between a clean hit and a miss that compromised the entire operation. Santos, I'm seeing some radio chatter down in the village. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece. Might be routine, but thought you should know. Maria shifted her attention to the village that sprawled along the valley floor below the compound. Through her scope, she could see people going about their daily routines. Children playing in dusty streets, women hanging laundry, men gathering in small groups outside the local mosque. It looked peaceful, but appearances could be deceiving in this part of the world. I'm not seeing anything unusual from up here, she reported. Normal daily activity. But I'll keep monitoring. The truth was that distinguishing between routine activity and potential threats required experience that went beyond technical training. Maria had learned to read the subtle signs, the way people moved when they were nervous, how conversations changed when strangers were nearby, the differences between normal caution and active surveillance. Execute. Morrison's voice was barely a whisper through the radio. Thompson's charges detonated with a muffled thump that sent a small cloud of dust and debris into the air. The explosion was precise, creating an opening just large enough for the team to move through without bringing down half the wall. Maria watched through her scope as the 4 SEALs flowed through the breach like water, finding the path of least resistance. For exactly 37 seconds, everything went according to plan. Rodriguez disappeared into the compound's interior courtyard, followed closely by Morrison and Garcia. Thompson brought up the rear, already prepping charges for their exit route. Through the windows of the main building, Maria could see the faint glow of flashlights as the team began their search for the target. Then the world exploded into chaos. The first burst of automatic weapons fire came from a position that shouldn't have existed according to their intelligence. Maria's scope swept across the compound, searching for muzzle flashes as her teammates' voices filled the radio with urgent tactical communications. Contact front. Multiple shooters in the main building. Rodriguez is hit. Need immediate medical. This isn't right. There are too many of them. Maria's training kicked in with mechanical precision. She identified the first muzzle flash in a second-story window and sent a round downrange before her conscious mind had fully processed the target. The flash disappeared, but two more immediately took its place. Santos, we need immediate support. Morrison's voice carried the controlled urgency of a man trying to maintain command while his plan fell apart around him. This was a setup. They were waiting for us. Through her scope, Maria could see the tactical situation developing with horrible clarity. Her teammates were pinned down in the compound's courtyard, caught in crossfire from positions that intelligence had assured them would be empty. Rodriguez was down, though she could see Garcia dragging him toward cover behind a low wall. Thompson was laying suppressive fire while Morrison tried to organize their withdrawal. But the compound had become a killing field. Enemy fighters were emerging from concealed positions throughout the building complex, and more were appearing on the surrounding walls. Someone had known they were coming, had prepared an elaborate trap, and now Team 7 was caught in the middle of it. Maria's rifle spoke again, the sharp crack of a shot echoing across the valley. Another muzzle flash disappeared, but the enemy had numbers and position. For every fighter she eliminated, two more seemed to take his place. Her teammates were professional enough to make every shot count, but they were vastly outnumbered and caught in a tactical nightmare. We need an exit strategy. Thompson's voice came through the radio between the bursts of his automatic rifle. The breach is compromised. They've got it covered from multiple angles. Maria swept her scope across the compound, analyzing the tactical situation with the cold calculation that had made her one of the Navy's most valued snipers. The team's planned escape route was indeed blocked. Enemy fighters had moved into position to cover the breach Thompson had created, turning their exit into a death trap. But there was another possibility. Morrison, can you reach the western wall? Maria's voice was calm despite the urgency of the situation. I can see a section that's not under direct observation. 50 meters from your current position. Negative. Morrison's reply came between bursts of return fire. Too much open ground. We'd be sitting ducks. Maria was already calculating angles and distances. The western wall was indeed exposed to fire from several positions, but those positions were within her engagement envelope. If she could eliminate the threats quickly enough, her teammates might have a window to make their escape. Give me 30 seconds to clear the field, she said, settling into her rifle with the focused intensity that had made her legendary among her peers. When I call it, you move fast and don't stop until you're over that wall. What followed was 30 seconds of the most precise shooting of Maria's career. Her rifle became an instrument of surgical precision, each shot carefully placed to eliminate specific threats in a predetermined sequence. She started with the positions that commanded the best fields of fire, working methodically through the enemy dispositions that covered the western wall. The first shot took out a fighter who'd been setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The second eliminated a machine gun nest that would have shredded anyone attempting to cross the open ground. The third and fourth shots silenced two riflemen who'd positioned themselves to provide overlapping coverage of the escape route. Move now! Maria's command cut through the chaos as she continued engaging targets. Western wall. Go! She watched through her scope as her teammates broke cover and sprinted across the exposed courtyard. Garcia had Rodriguez slung across his shoulders in a fireman's carry, moving with strength and determination despite the additional weight. Morrison and Thompson provided covering fire, their automatic weapons adding to the symphony of gunfire that filled the compound. An enemy fighter appeared at a window, raising his rifle to target the fleeing SEALs. Maria's shot took him down before he could fire. Another fighter tried to emerge from cover behind a low wall. Her next round sent him diving back into concealment. The enemy was adapting to her presence now, becoming more cautious about exposing themselves to her fire. But their caution was costing them the initiative, giving her teammates the precious seconds they needed to reach the relative safety of the western wall. "We're at the wall." Morrison's voice carried relief and continued tension. "Thompson's setting charges." Maria continued providing overwatch, her scope sweeping the compound for any threat that might emerge. The enemy fire was becoming more organized now, coordinated by someone who understood tactics and wasn't panicking despite the losses they'd sustained. Whoever had set this trap was a professional, and that made the situation even more dangerous. Thompson's charges blew a neat hole in the western wall, and Maria watched her teammates disappear through the opening into the rocky terrain beyond the compound. But their troubles were far from over. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters regrouping and organizing pursuit. They'd be coming after Team 7, and they'd have local knowledge of the terrain that could give them significant advantages. "Team is clear of the compound," Morrison reported, beginning movement to extraction point Alpha. But Maria's scope was telling a different story. Vehicle engines were starting up in the village below, and dust clouds were beginning to form as trucks loaded with armed fighters prepared to join the pursuit. The enemy wasn't just letting them go. They were organizing a manhunt, and they had the numbers and local support to make it effective. "Morrison, you've got vehicles moving up from the village," Maria reported, tracking the convoy through her scope. "At least 6 trucks full of fighters. They're going to try to cut you off at the extraction point." The extraction point was a clearing 3 kilometers away where a helicopter would be waiting to pull them out. But if enemy vehicles could reach that location first, the team would be walking into another trap. They needed a new plan, and they needed it quickly. "Can you slow them down?" Morrison's question carried the weight of 5 lives hanging in the balance. Maria was already calculating ranges and lead times. The vehicles were moving fast along the mountain road, kicking up dust trails that made them easy to track, but harder to hit precisely. At the ranges involved, she'd be pushing the absolute limits of her rifle's capabilities, shooting at moving targets under less than ideal conditions. "I can try," she replied, settling into her shooting position with renewed focus. "But I'll need to relocate after a few shots. They'll figure out where I am pretty quickly." The first shot was the hardest. Maria had to calculate the vehicle's speed, account for the distance and elevation difference, and time her shot to intersect with the target's movement. She squeezed the trigger with mechanical precision, watching through her scope as the bullet streaked downrange toward its target. The round punched through the windshield of the lead truck, and the vehicle swerved violently before rolling off the road in a cloud of dust and debris. The convoy immediately scattered, drivers zigzagging to avoid presenting steady targets, while passengers jumped out to take cover behind rocks and trees. Maria was already shifting to her backup position, a location she'd identified earlier as her fallback if her primary shooting spot became compromised. She moved with practiced efficiency, knowing that return fire would be incoming within seconds of her next shot. Her second shot disabled another vehicle, this one by punching around through the engine block that sent steam and smoke pouring from under the hood. The convoy's advance had stopped, but Maria knew it was only temporary. The enemy would find cover, organize themselves, and continue the pursuit on foot if necessary. "Convoy is stopped for now," she reported, already scanning for her next targets. "But they'll be moving again soon. You need to reach that extraction point fast." Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters taking cover and beginning to organize themselves for a coordinated assault on her position. They'd figured out approximately where her shots were coming from, and they had enough people to surround her location if she stayed put much longer. Maria made the tactical decision that would define the rest of the operation. Instead of continuing to engage targets from a distance, she would leave her overwatch position and move to directly support her teammates. It meant giving up the advantages of range and elevation, but it also meant she could provide close support when they needed it most. She began moving downslope, using the terrain to mask her movement while staying within supporting distance of Team 7's escape route. Her rifle remained ready, but Now she was thinking about close-range engagements and the possibility of hand-to-hand fighting if the enemy managed to close the distance. The radio chattered with updates as Morrison led his team through the rocky terrain toward the extraction point. Rodriguez was conscious but wounded, slowing their movement despite Garcia's best efforts to keep immobile. Thompson was managing their rear guard, laying improvised explosive devices along their back trail to discourage pursuit. "Maria, where are you?" Morrison's voice carried concern that went beyond tactical considerations. He knew that leaving Overwatch meant she was taking significant personal risks to support the team. "I'm moving to intercept the foot pursuit," she replied, checking her ammunition count and calculating distances to likely engagement areas. "Someone needs to slow them down, and I'm in the best position to do it." What she didn't say was that her decision was based on more than tactical considerations. Rodriguez was wounded, the team was moving slowly, and the enemy had numbers and local knowledge on their side. Without someone to delay the pursuit, Team 7 might not make it to the extraction point at all. Maria had made her choice. She would buy her teammates the time they needed, whatever the cost. The mountain terrain that had seemed so familiar during their approach now felt like hostile territory as Maria moved through the rocks and scrub brush. Every shadow could hide an enemy fighter. Every sound might signal an approaching threat. She'd trained for this scenario, but training and reality were different animals entirely. Her movement was deliberate and calculated. She used the natural features of the landscape to mask her position while maintaining sight lines that would allow her to engage targets at medium range. The enemy would be moving fast, trying to catch up with her teammates, but they'd also be making noise and taking risks that she could exploit. The first group of pursuers appeared exactly where Maria had expected them. 6 fighters moving in a loose formation through a narrow ravine that offered the fastest route between the compound and the extraction point. They were moving with purpose, but not with the tactical discipline she'd learned to expect from professional soldiers. Maria positioned herself on the high ground, overlooking their route, checking her range and calculating the wind conditions. At this distance, she could take out 2 or maybe 3 of them before the others found cover and began returning fire. But eliminating half the group would force the survivors to move more cautiously, buying precious time for Team 7. Her first shot dropped the lead fighter cleanly. The sharp crack of her rifle echoed off the rocky walls of the ravine, causing immediate confusion among the remaining pursuers. They scattered for cover, but Maria had already identified her second target and squeezed off another round. The second fighter spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but he was out of the fight and would require medical attention from his companions. Sometimes a wounded enemy was more tactically valuable than a dead one, because it tied up additional personnel and slowed down the entire group. Return fire began spattering against the rocks around Maria's position, but the angles were wrong and the enemy was shooting blind. She'd chosen her spot well, with solid cover and multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. But she couldn't stay here indefinitely. The enemy would eventually work around her flanks or call for reinforcements. Target group slowed down. She reported into radio. Moving to next intercept position, Maria began working her way through the terrain toward her next planned position. She'd studied the topographical maps extensively during mission preparation, identifying choke points and natural defensive positions along the likely escape routes. Now that preparation was paying dividends as she moved from one prepared position to another. Her radio crackled with updates from Team 7. They were making progress toward the extraction point, but Rodriguez's condition was deteriorating. The wound he'd sustained in the compound was more serious than they'd initially realized, and he was losing blood despite Garcia's field medical treatment. "We need that bird in the air." Morrison's voice carried the strain of command decisions that balanced mission success against the lives of his people. "Rodriguez needs a trauma center, not a field dressing." The extraction helicopter was still 20 minutes out, following a flight path designed to avoid enemy air defenses and maintain tactical surprise. But 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours if Rodriguez went into shock or if the pursuing enemy forces reached the landing zone first. Maria reached her second intercept position just as another group of enemy fighters appeared in her field of view. This group was larger, maybe 10 or 12 fighters, and they were moving with more tactical awareness than the first group. Someone was learning from their mistakes and adapting their approach. She settled into her new shooting position and began acquiring targets. The range was longer this time, pushing her rifle toward its maximum effective distance. But the targets were moving predictably through terrain that channeled their movement into predictable patterns. Her first shot at this range was more art than science. She had to account for bullet drop over the extended distance, compensate for wind effects that became more pronounced at longer ranges, and time her shot to intersect with a moving target whose exact speed she had to estimate by observation. The round found its mark, dropping one of the fighters and immediately altering the behavior of the entire group. They dove for cover and began returning fire, but their shots were falling short of Maria's position. The combination of range and elevation was working in her favor, at least for the moment. She shifted position within her rocky shelter and engaged another target. This shot was slightly off, chipping rock near the fighter's position, but missing the man himself. The enemy was learning to use cover more effectively, making her job harder with each engagement. But the important thing was that she was slowing them down. Every shot forced them to take cover. Every casualty made them move more cautiously. Every minute of delay gave Team 7 more separation from their pursuers. Multiple groups converging on my position, Maria reported, watching through her scope as enemy fighters began coordinating their movements. I count at least 20 hostiles, and they're getting organized. The tactical situation was developing exactly as she'd feared. The enemy had enough people to surround her position while maintaining pursuit of the main team. Professional fighters would have done exactly that, forcing her to choose between abandoning her position or getting trapped in an untenable situation. Maria made her decision with the same calm calculation that had defined her entire military career. She would continue delaying the pursuit for as long as tactically feasible, then withdraw before the enemy could close the trap. It was a delicate balance between maximum impact and personal survival. Her radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Santos, what's your situation? We're hearing a lot of gunfire from your direction." "I'm managing the pursuit," she replied, settling her rifle on another target. "But you need to pick up the pace. I can't hold them indefinitely." The truth was starker than her calm report suggested. Maria was facing overwhelming numbers with limited ammunition and no support. She could continue her delaying action for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes before tactical reality forced her to withdraw. If Team 7 couldn't reach the extraction point by then, they'd all be in serious trouble. She engaged another target, watching the fighter drop behind cover as a round sparked off the rock near his position. Close, but not close enough. The enemy was learning to present minimal targets, using cover and movement to make her job increasingly difficult. A new sound reached her ears through the constant chatter of small arms fire. Vehicle engines getting closer. The enemy had managed to get some of their disabled trucks running again, or they'd brought up additional vehicles from other locations. Either way, it meant they'd have mobility that could allow them to outflank her position or get ahead of Team 7. "Vehicles approaching from the south," Maria reported, swinging her scope toward the new threat. "Looks like they're trying to cut off the extraction route." Through her scope, she could see a truck loaded with armed fighters bouncing along a rough mountain track that would intersect the route to the extraction point. If that truck reached the intersection before Team 7, they'd be walking into another ambush. The range to the truck was extreme for her rifle, at the very edge of what was possible under ideal conditions. The target was moving fast over rough terrain, creating a nearly impossible shot that required perfect timing and more luck than Maria was comfortable counting on. But it was the shot she had to take. Maria calculated lead time, elevation compensation, and wind drift in the fraction of a second available to her. She tracked the truck through her scope, waiting for the perfect moment when all the variables aligned. When that moment came, she squeezed the trigger with the smooth precision that had made her reputation. The bullet crossed the valley in just over 2 seconds, arcing through the thin mountain air before intersecting with the truck's windshield. Maria watched through her scope as the vehicle lurched violently to one side, then rolled down the steep embankment in a cloud of dust and debris. "Vehicle neutralized," she reported, already scanning for the next threat. "But there will be more. You need to move faster." Her ammunition was running low. Each shot had to count now, because she wouldn't have enough rounds to waste on marginal targets. The enemy was pressing closer to her position, using fire and movement tactics to advance undercover while maintaining pressure on her defensive position. Maria began preparing for her withdrawal. She identified her escape route, cached unnecessary equipment to reduce weight, and calculated the timing necessary to break contact without being pursued immediately. The enemy would figure out she was gone soon enough, but every minute of head start could prove crucial. "Team 7, what's your ETA to extraction?" she asked, beginning her movement toward the escape route. 12 minutes, Morrison replied. "Rodriguez is hanging in there, but we need that helicopter ready when we arrive." 12 minutes. Maria calculated distances and movement rates in her head. If she could delay the pursuit for another 5 minutes, then successfully break contact and move to an overwatch position covering the extraction point, she might be able to provide support during the pickup operation. It was possible, but it would require perfect execution and a reasonable amount of tactical luck. Maria had learned not to count on luck, but sometimes it was the only factor that stood between success and catastrophe. She settled into her final defensive position, a rocky outcropping that offered excellent fields of fire, but limited escape options. This would be her last stand before withdrawing to support the extraction. Every shot from this position had to count, because she wouldn't get many opportunities to engage targets before the enemy forced her to move. The first fighter to appear in her scope never knew what hit him. Maria's shot was perfect, dropping him cleanly before he could alert his companions to her exact position. The second fighter was more cautious, using cover and concealment to approach her position indirectly. She waited for him to make a mistake, rifle ready, and scope tracking his movement through the rocks. When he briefly exposed himself to get a better angle on her position, Maria's shot sent him diving back into cover. Not a kill, but another fighter removed from the immediate threat. Time was running out. Maria could hear the enemy fighters coordinating their approach, calling out positions, and organizing a final assault on her defensive position. She had maybe 2 more minutes before they'd have enough people in position to overwhelm her through sheer numbers. She began her withdrawal, moving carefully through the rocks while maintaining awareness of the approaching threats. The enemy would discover her position was abandoned soon enough, but by then she'd be long gone and moving toward the extraction point. As Maria moved through the mountain terrain toward her final destination, she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors beginning to echo off the valley walls. The extraction bird was finally approaching, right on schedule despite everything that had gone wrong with the mission. But she could also hear the sounds of pursuit behind her, getting closer as the enemy realized she was no longer pinning them down from her defensive position. The race to the extraction point had begun, and everything would depend on timing that had to be measured in seconds rather than minutes. The sound of rotors grew stronger as Maria moved through the rocky terrain toward the extraction point. The MH-60 Blackhawk was still invisible behind the mountain ridges, but its distinctive sound signature told her the pilot was following the planned approach route. In a few minutes, the helicopter would crest the final ridge and begin its descent into the landing zone. Those few minutes would determine whether Team 7 made it home or became another casualty statistic in a war that had already claimed too many good people. Maria reached an elevated position that offered commanding views of the extraction zone, just as Team 7 emerged from the tree line below. Through her scope, she could see Morrison leading the team across the rocky clearing that served as their pickup point. Garcia still had Rodriguez in a fireman's carry, moving with determination despite the physical strain of carrying a wounded teammate across rough terrain. Thompson brought up the rear, constantly checking their back trail for signs of pursuit. His demolition charges had slowed the enemy advance, but they hadn't stopped it entirely. Maria could see dust clouds in the distance, marking the approach of additional hostile forces, racing to reach the extraction point before the helicopter could complete its mission. The Black Hawk appeared over the ridge exactly on schedule, its pilot following the terrain at low altitude to avoid enemy air defenses. The aircraft settled into a hover over the landing zone, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris that would provide concealment, but also complicate the extraction operation. Maria settled into her rifle, providing overwatch as her teammates moved toward the helicopter. This was always the most vulnerable moment of any extraction operation. The aircraft was exposed and relatively stationary. The team was exposed in open ground, and any enemy forces in the area would be converging on the obvious target. Through her scope, she spotted the first threat. Enemy fighters emerging from concealment on the opposite side of the valley, setting up weapons positions that could engage the helicopter during its most vulnerable phase. The range was long, but not impossible for her rifle under these conditions. Her first shot silenced a fighter who'd been setting up what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The weapon tumbled away from his position as he fell, eliminating a threat that could have brought down the helicopter with a single well-placed shot. Maria immediately shifted to acquire her next target. More enemy fighters were appearing, moving with the organized purpose of a coordinated assault. Someone was directing their movements, positioning them to maximize their effectiveness against the extraction operation. Maria realized she was facing a professional military unit rather than the loosely organized militia fighters she'd been engaging throughout the mission. Her second shot took down a machine gunner who'd been positioning his weapon to engage the helicopter's approach route. The heavy weapon's bipod legs collapsed as the operator fell, but Maria could see other fighters moving to take his place. She was buying time, but time was running out quickly. "Santos, we need immediate suppression." Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter as enemy fire began impacting around the landing zone. Multiple threats engaging the bird. Maria's rifle began speaking with mechanical precision. Each shot was carefully placed to eliminate specific threats or force enemy fighters to take cover rather than engaging the helicopter. She worked through her remaining ammunition with the systematic efficiency of someone who understood that every round had to count. A fighter appeared at a window in a stone building overlooking the landing zone. Maria's shot shattered the window and silenced the threat before he could fire. Another fighter tried to advance to a better firing position using a stone wall for cover. Her next round forced him to retreat, buying precious seconds for the extraction to continue. The helicopter pilot was fighting his own battle, maintaining position despite incoming fire, while his crew chief provided suppressive fire with the aircraft's door-mounted machine gun. The big helicopter bucked and weaved as the pilot made constant micro-adjustments to avoid giving the enemy steady aim points. "Teams loading," Morrison reported as Maria watched her teammates climb aboard the Black Hawk. Garcia passed Rodriguez's unconscious form to the helicopter's medic, then hauled himself aboard despite his own exhaustion. Thompson provided covering fire from the helicopter's doorway as Morrison made one final check of the landing zone. But the enemy was closing in. Maria could see armed fighters moving through the rocks on multiple sides of the extraction zone, coordinating their approach to arrive just as the helicopter began its departure. Someone with tactical training was orchestrating their movements, timing the assault to maximize effectiveness. Maria made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. Instead of beginning her own movement toward the helicopter, she remained in position to provide continued overwatch. Her teammates needed covering fire during the critical moments of takeoff, when the aircraft would be most vulnerable to ground fire. "Santos, get to the bird." Morrison's voice carried command authority and personal concern. "We're loaded and ready for departure." "Negative," Maria replied, settling deeper into her shooting position. Too many threats still active. I'll cover your departure and extract on the backup bird. It was a lie, and she suspected Morrison knew it. There was no backup helicopter. If she missed this extraction, she'd be on her own in hostile territory with limited ammunition and an organized enemy force hunting for her. But her teammates needed those extra minutes of covering fire to get clear safely. The helicopter began its departure sequence, rising slowly from the landing zone while maintaining enough altitude to clear the surrounding ridges. Maria tracked multiple targets through her scope, engaging any fighter who presented a clear shot at the departing aircraft. Her ammunition finally ran dry as the Black Hawk disappeared over the ridge, carrying Team 7 to safety. Maria watched the aircraft's lights fade into the distance before beginning her own movement away from the extraction zone. The enemy would reach her position soon, and she needed to be gone before they arrived. But as she began moving through the rocks, Maria realized she wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps on stone reached her ears, followed by voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The enemy had moved faster than she'd expected, and they'd positioned themselves between her and her planned escape route. Maria found herself in the nightmare scenario every operator feared, alone in hostile territory, out of ammunition, and surrounded by enemy forces who knew the terrain better than she did. Her rifle was useless without rounds to feed it, but it might still serve as a psychological deterrent if she could avoid close contact with the enemy. She moved through the darkness with the stealth skills learned during years of special operations training. Every step was calculated to minimize noise, every movement planned to use available cover and concealment. The enemy was searching for her, but they were searching with the confidence of hunters who believed their prey was trapped. Maria's survival training kicked in with mechanical precision. She needed to evade immediate contact, find a source of water, establish a defensible position, and signal for rescue. The priorities were simple enough to understand, but challenging to execute when armed fighters were actively searching for her. The voices were getting closer. Maria could distinguish individual words now, picked up from her basic language training during pre-deployment preparation. They were coordinating their search, establishing a perimeter, calling for additional support. Professional military terminology from fighters who understood small unit tactics. She pressed herself against a large boulder, controlling her breathing while armed figures passed within meters of her position. Their flashlights swept the area systematically, but they hadn't yet figured out exactly where she'd gone aground. The darkness was her ally, but it wouldn't protect her indefinitely. One of the searchers stopped near her hiding place, speaking into a radio in urgent tones. Maria couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested he was reporting something significant to his superiors. Perhaps they found evidence of her passage through the area, or maybe they were receiving new intelligence about her likely location. The searcher moved on, but Maria knew her position was compromised. She needed to relocate before they organized a systematic search of the area. Moving carefully through the shadows, she began working her way toward higher ground that might offer better concealment and clearer sight lines. As she climbed through the rocks, Maria's radio crackled with an incoming transmission. She immediately turned down the volume, but not before catching Morrison's voice attempting to establish contact. Her teammates had reached safety and were trying to coordinate her rescue, but any radio transmission in her current situation was like lighting a beacon for the enemy searchers. The irony wasn't lost on her. The radio that could coordinate her rescue might also be the thing that got her killed if the enemy used direction-finding equipment to locate her position. She made the tactical decision to maintain radio silence unless she absolutely needed to transmit emergency information. Hours passed as Maria played a deadly game of hide and seek through the mountain terrain. The enemy search continued with professional persistence, but the darkness and difficult terrain were working in her favor. She managed to stay ahead of the search teams while gradually working her way toward terrain that offered better long-term survival prospects. By dawn, She'd reached a defensible position in rocky terrain that offered concealment, multiple escape routes, and access to a small water source. It wasn't ideal, but it was sustainable for the short term while she waited for rescue operations to develop. Maria's radio crackled with another transmission, this one from a different voice using call signs she didn't recognize. Rescue operations were being coordinated, but they take time to organize and execute safely. She needed to remain hidden and avoid contact with enemy forces until help arrived. The waiting began. Maria settled into the patient routine of survival, conserving energy while maintaining constant awareness of her surroundings. She'd been trained for this scenario, but training and reality were different experiences entirely. Now she faced the ultimate test of everything she'd learned during her years as a Navy SEAL. The mountain morning brought new challenges as enemy search operations resumed with daylight visibility. Maria watched through binoculars salvaged from her equipment as organized search teams began working through the terrain below her position. They were methodical and professional, covering ground systematically while maintaining communication with their command structure. But they were also predictable. Maria began to recognize their search patterns, identify their radio frequencies, and understand their tactical procedures. Information was power, and every detail she gathered about enemy operations might prove valuable when rescue operations finally commenced. Her radio remained silent, but Maria knew her teammates wouldn't abandon her. Somewhere beyond these mountains, Morrison was coordinating with higher command to organize a rescue mission. Thompson was probably volunteering to lead the operation personally. Garcia was ensuring Rodriguez received proper medical treatment while preparing to return for her extraction. The question wasn't whether they'd come for her. The question was whether she could remain hidden long enough for them to get organized and reach her position safely. 3 days of survival in the Afghan mountains had taught Maria lessons that no training exercise could replicate. She'd learned to distinguish between the sounds of enemy patrols and normal mountain wildlife. She discovered which plants held moisture and which rocks provided the best concealment from thermal imaging devices. Most importantly, she learned to manage the psychological pressure of isolation while maintaining the tactical awareness necessary for survival. The enemy search operations had evolved during those 3 days. Initial sweep teams had given way to persistent observation posts and random patrols designed to catch her if she tried to move to a different location. Someone with extensive counterinsurgency experience was directing the operation, understanding that patience and systematic coverage would eventually locate a hidden target. Maria's water situation was becoming critical. The small seep she'd found provided enough moisture to survive, but barely. Her food situation was more manageable since she could go weeks without eating, but dehydration would kill her in days under these conditions. She needed to either find a better water source or receive extraction soon. On the morning of the 4th day, her radio crackled with a transmission that made her heart race. Falcon 7, this is Overwatch. How copy? The call sign was wrong, but the voice was unmistakably Morrison's. He was using a non-standard identifier to avoid compromising the rescue operation if enemy forces were monitoring their communications. Maria made the tactical decision to break radio silence. Overwatch, this is Falcon 7. I copy 5x5. Current position is defensible, but water situation is critical. Copy that, Falcon 7. We have eyes on your general area. Can you provide a discrete signal for positive identification? Maria looked around her position for something that could serve as an identification marker without alerting nearby enemy forces. She settled on repositioning some white stones into an arrow pattern that would be visible from the air, but might appear natural to ground observers. Signal placed, she transmitted. Arrow configuration pointing toward my position. Minutes passed before Morrison responded. We have positive identification. Extraction team is inbound. Estimate 20 minutes to your location. Be prepared for immediate movement when we arrive. 20 minutes. After 4 days of hiding and surviving, rescue is finally approaching. But Maria knew that the most dangerous phase of any rescue operation was often the extraction itself, when aircraft and personnel were most vulnerable to enemy fire. She began preparing for immediate movement, organizing her limited gear, and identifying the best routes between her current position and potential landing zones in the area. The helicopter would need a relatively clear space to land or hover for pickup, and those locations would be obvious to enemy observers as well. The sound of rotors reached her ears exactly 20 minutes later. But instead of the single helicopter she'd expected, Maria could hear multiple aircraft approaching from different directions. Through her binoculars, she spotted two Black Hawks escorted by a pair of Apache attack helicopters providing close air support. Morrison wasn't taking any chances with her rescue. The lead Apache swept over her position, its crew scanning for threats while the extraction helicopters approached from a different direction. The attack helicopter's presence would discourage enemy forces from interfering with the pickup operation, but it also announced to everyone in the area that something significant was happening. Falcon 7, mark your position with smoke if you have it. Morrison's voice cut through the increasing noise of multiple helicopters. Maria activated a small smoke grenade from her survival kit, sending a thin column of colored smoke into the morning air. The signal would be visible to the aircraft crews, but would also pinpoint her location for any enemy forces in the area. Speed would be essential once the smoke appeared. The extraction helicopter swept in low and fast, its crew chief scanning for threats while the aircraft settled into a hover over the rocky terrain near Maria's position. Dust and debris kicked up by the rotor wash created a brown cloud that provided concealment, but also limited visibility for everyone involved. Maria broke cover and sprinted toward the aircraft, leaving behind the position that had sheltered her for 4 days. The helicopter's door gunner provided covering fire as she approached, his weapon sweeping potential threat areas while maintaining communication with the Apache escorts overhead. She reached the helicopter and hauled herself aboard just as enemy fire began impacting the area around the landing zone. The aircraft immediately lifted off, gaining altitude and speed while the Apache escorts engaged targets that were trying to interfere with the extraction. "Welcome back," Morrison said, pulling Maria further into the aircraft as the crew chief continued providing suppressive fire. "Rodriguez is going to be fine, and Thompson's been driving everyone crazy planning a rescue operation." Maria managed an exhausted smile as the helicopter banked away from the landing zone. Through the doorway, she could see the Apache attack helicopters engaging multiple targets on the ground, their chain guns and rockets systematically eliminating threats that had been hunting her for 4 days. The flight back to base took 40 minutes, during which Maria received initial medical attention and debriefing from Morrison. The original mission had been completely compromised, with intelligence suggesting that enemy forces had been waiting specifically for a SEAL team to arrive. Someone with access to classified information had set an elaborate trap. "We think it was a test," Morrison explained as the helicopter flew through mountain valleys toward friendly territory. "Someone wanted to see how we'd respond to a compromised operation, what our extraction procedures looked like, how long we'd persist in trying to rescue isolated personnel. If that was true, then Maria's 4 days of survival had been part of a larger intelligence operation designed to study American special operations procedures. Her resistance and eventual successful extraction might have provided valuable counterintelligence information, but it had also revealed capabilities that enemies could plan against in future operations. The helicopter finally crossed in a friendly airspace, and Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders for the first time in 4 days. The mountains below were still dangerous, but they were no longer hunting grounds where every shadow might hide an enemy fighter. Landing at the forward operating base felt surreal after 4 days of survival in hostile territory. Maria's legs were unsteady as she climbed down from the helicopter, her body readjusting to safety after days of constant alertness. Medical personnel immediately surrounded her, checking for injuries and dehydration while intelligence officers waited to begin detailed debriefing. But first, she needed to see Rodriguez. She found him in the base medical facility, conscious and complaining about the hospital food. His wound had required surgery, but military doctors had managed to repair the damage without permanent complications. He'd be returning to active duty within a few weeks. "Heard you had an interesting vacation in the mountains," Rodriguez said, managing a weak smile despite his condition. "Next time, maybe try somewhere with better room service." "Next time I'm staying in Overwatch where I belong," Maria replied, genuinely relieved to see her teammate conscious and recovering. Let other people handle the up-close adventure tourism. Thompson appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who hadn't slept much in 4 days. "Santos, you look terrible, but I guess that's what happens when you spend a long weekend camping without proper gear." "Thanks for the rescue," Maria said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How did you manage to convince Command to authorize that much firepower for one stranded SEAL?" "Turns out they really don't like losing people," Thompson replied. "Especially people who've spent 4 days gathering intelligence about enemy search procedures while managing to avoid capture. Your survival operation provided more useful information than the original mission would have." Garcia joined them, completing the reunion of Team 7. His expression carried the professional satisfaction of a medic whose patients had all survived despite challenging circumstances. "Rodriguez is going to make a full recovery, and the intelligence debriefing from your survival experience is already changing how we approach operations in this area." The debriefing sessions that followed Maria's rescue consumed several days and involved personnel from multiple intelligence agencies. Her observations about enemy search procedures, communication protocols, and tactical organization provided insights that would influence future operations throughout the region. But the most significant outcome was the realization that their original mission had been compromised from the beginning. Someone with access to classified information was feeding intelligence to enemy forces, and Maria's successful survival and extraction had provided the final pieces of evidence necessary to identify the security breach. Within a month of Team 7's return from the mountains, a civilian contractor with access to mission planning information was arrested for providing intelligence to hostile forces. The arrest broke up a spy ring that had been responsible for several failed operations and numerous American casualties. Maria's 4-day survival ordeal had been the key to unraveling the entire network. 6 months later, Team 7 was back in the United States, preparing for their next deployment. Maria had been promoted and assigned additional responsibilities, training other snipers in long-range precision shooting. Her experience surviving in hostile territory while providing covering fire for her teammates had become a case study taught at special operations training facilities. But for Maria, the most important outcome was simpler than professional recognition or career advancement. Team 7 had faced impossible odds and brought everyone home alive. Rodriguez had made a complete recovery and returned to active duty. The intelligence they'd gathered had protected other American forces from similar ambushes. Sometimes the mission wasn't about accomplishing the original objective. Sometimes success was measured by the people who made it home safely, the intelligence gathered through adversity, and the lessons learned that would protect others in the future. Maria Santos had learned to shoot as a child in the Texas Hill Country, hunting deer with her grandfather, who taught her that patience and precision would take her farther than raw talent. Now, years later, and thousands of miles from those hunting grounds, those same principles had brought her teammates home alive and helped uncover a security breach that might have cost many more lives. The mountains of Afghanistan had tested every skill she possessed, and some she discovered only when survival demanded them. She'd faced impossible odds with limited resources and managed to accomplish something that military textbooks said couldn't be done. Survive for 4 days in hostile territory while providing tactical support that ensured her teammates' successful extraction. As Team 7 prepared for their next mission, Maria cleaned and maintained her rifle with the same careful attention she'd learned as a child. The weapon had served her well in the mountains, and she knew it would serve her well wherever the mission took them next. Some things never changed. Patience and precision would always be the foundation of everything she did, whether hunting deer in Texas or providing overwatch for the world's most elite warriors in the most dangerous places on Earth. The story ended as it had begun, with Maria Santos preparing her rifle and waiting for the mission to start. But now she carried the knowledge that when everything went wrong, when the plan fell apart, and the odds became impossible, precision shooting and unwavering determination could still bring everyone home. In her first deployment, she'd missed those signs during a village patrol. The ambush that followed had wounded 2 Marines and taught Maria that situational awareness wasn't just about what you could see through a rifle scope. Since then, she'd made it a point to study every environment, learning to read the human terrain as carefully as she read the physical landscape. 10 minutes out, Morrison announced, "Final equipment check. Once we go active, radio discipline becomes critical. Santos, you're our lifeline out here." Maria performed one last inspection of her gear. Rifle zeroed and ready, spare magazines accessible, radio functioning perfectly, emergency medical kit within reach. She'd learned long ago that the time to discover equipment problems wasn't when bullets started flying. Her shooting position gave her commanding views of the entire compound and the approaches from 3 directions. If the team needed covering fire during their withdrawal, she'd be able to provide it. If they encountered resistance inside the compound, she could eliminate threats through the windows and doorways visible from her perch. But the job came with built-in frustration. Maria would see everything that happened, but she'd be too far away to directly intervene if her teammates ran into close-quarters trouble. She'd be watching through a scope while people she cared about fought for their lives, limited to providing what support she could from distance. "Rodriguez is at the perimeter," Morrison's voice cut through her thoughts. "Entry in 3 minutes." Through her scope, Maria watched Rodriguez approach the compound's eastern wall. He moved like a shadow, using every bit of available cover to remain invisible to the guards. His route took advantage of blind spots that the team had identified during their reconnaissance, timing his movements to coincide with the guard rotations they'd observed. "Guard rotation on schedule," Maria reported. "North wall clear for the next 3 minutes." This was the critical moment when planning met reality. All their preparation, all their intelligence gathering, all their tactical discussions would be tested in the next few minutes. Either their plan would work as designed, or they'd have to improvise their way out of whatever complications arose. "Charges set," Thompson's whisper came through the radio. "Ready to make an entrance." Maria held her breath, waiting for Morrison's command. In her scope, she could see Rodriguez pressed against the compound wall, Thompson crouched nearby with his hand on the detonator, Garcia and Morrison positioned to move through whatever opening Thompson created. Everything looked perfect. The guards were exactly where they were supposed to be, following the patterns the team had observed. The compound appeared quiet except for normal activity. Weather conditions were ideal for the operation. That should have been Maria's first warning sign. In her experience, when everything looked perfect, it usually meant you weren't seeing the whole picture.